Welcome back to Carneades.org. Today we're going to be looking at the question, is God evil? 4 arguments for the case that God is not all good. So, many religions, though not all, justify worshiping and following a particular deity because of that deity's proclaimed righteousness, that their deity is all good and therefore deserving of praise. One objection to this belief is the possibility that such a deity is in fact evil. Now, there are several arguments to challenge the claim that a given God is all good. While these are sometimes formulated as arguments against the existence of God from an atheistic perspective by breaking down the evidence for an all-good God, they're also formulated from a maltheistic or dystheistic point of view, arguing that God does exist, but is evil, or at least is not wholly good. Check out our video on dystheism for more. The arguments we will briefly examine here are the scriptural argument, God does evil in Scripture, the evidentiary argument, religious people suffer more, often due to their religion, the evil God challenge argument, evidence is just as strong for an evil God as a good one, and the trickster duplication argument, a world created by a good God and a trickster God would look indistinguishable. So, first off, let's take a look at the scriptural argument. So unlike other arguments, the scriptural argument for an evil God is dependent on the particular religion in question. However, the structure of the argument is generally the same. God does or encourages X in a given religious text, whether that's genocide in Deuteronomy 7:1 through 6, the Quran 9:5, slavery in Ephesians 6:5, the Quran 23:5 through 6, rape in Numbers 31:13 through 17, the Quran 4:24. You get the picture. X is immoral or wrong, therefore God is not all good. It seems, generally, we judge other humans by whether they actively encourage things that we think are wrong, such as genocide, slavery, rape, or actively do those things. If God were to do those things, it seems we would have a pretty good case for thinking that God is evil, or at least not wholly good. Now, there are a range of responses to this argument, ranging from claiming that X isn't wrong, that, you know what, genocide isn't that bad, slavery isn't that bad, it's allowed when God does it, to claiming that X is acceptable if God does it, to claiming that a given scriptural text should be interpreted figuratively. However, each of these requires biting a large bullet. Few people today think that rape, slavery, or genocide is morally acceptable for anyone, even those in power. Claiming a figurative interpretation of a religious text often defeats arguments for accepting that text, and therefore believing in that religion at all. Check out our video on the literalist trilemma for more with these problems of textual interpretation. Next up, the evidentiary problem. So, a good God might be expected to protect and provide for their chosen people, as many religious scriptures claim that a good God does. Philippians 4:19, Quran 9:51, etc. However, the level of religious belief in a country is negatively correlated with measures of income and welfare, meaning that the more religious you are, the worse you're doing, generally. There are many things that might explain this. Religions provide social safety nets in societies with weak governments. Education leads to higher standards of living and less religious populations, etc. But it doesn't allow for an all-powerful God who is actually protecting those who believe in him and harming those who do not, such a being could override any earthly causal mechanism quite easily. If anything, it provides more support for the opposite hypothesis, an evil God who harms those that believe and punishes the religious while rewarding the skeptics. It seems that the best explanation for what we see, if you believe that there's a God, is that God is evil, or at least doesn't care. Now, some might respond to such an argument by claiming that God's protection is not literal, or not in this world, only in the next. Though given the descriptions of God's protection in some scriptures, this would likely require avoiding complete literalism about these texts. Regardless, this is simply an argument to the best explanation. So while it may be useful against arguments that claim an all-good God is the best explanation for the world, it can't provide us with the justification that a strong deductive argument might. So while useful against other best explanation arguments, I'm not particularly convinced by this one. given its form of being an abductive argument. Now, one of the most famous arguments against an all-good God within philosophy is the, quote, evil God challenge. This is simply the argument that effectively all arguments for the existence of God, teleological, cosmological, etc., fail to provide any proof of God's goodness, and therefore provide just as much support for an evil God as a good one. Even the ontological argument, which claims to make the case for this property, faces serious issues in proving it. Check out our series on the ontological argument for more on why this is such a problem for the theist. Now, a common response to this argument is the problem of good, a parallel to the problem of evil. This objection makes the case that an all-evil God would create a world that's completely evil, full of pain and suffering. Since we do see good in the world could not be a result of an all-evil God. Now, there are several responses to this, such as evil theodicies that explain why an evil God would allow some happiness, e.g., to make the suffering all that much worse. The claim that given a world that has both evil and good in it, a God that is neither fully evil nor fully good actually makes the most sense. It seems that in a world where there's clearly evil and clearly good, a God that isn't fully either is the best explanation for such a world. And the argument that either theodicies are convincing or they're not. If they are convincing, then an evil God is just as likely as a good God, because the theodicy against the problem of good is just as sufficient as the theodicy against the problem of evil. If they're not, then the problem of evil itself can't be defeated by a theodicy, and so that is equally an issue for the theist. So either way, the theist is in trouble. The last argument we're going to look at is the duplication argument. So imagine a possible world where a trickster God wanted to appear to be good, when in fact being evil, perhaps punishing all good people in the afterlife, for example. Such a God would either create a physical world with more good, less good, or about the same amount of good as we see in the current world. If such a God would create a world with more good, we're clearly in a world that's ruled by an evil God, since a good God could have created more good, since it was logically possible to create a world with more good in it. Such a God would not create a world with less good if they were a trickster God, since if they're omnipotent, they could at least create the current world. And if such a God created a world with about the same amount of good as our current world, there's no way for us to know we are in a world with a truly good God or one with a trickster God, because they're, for all intents and purposes, qualitatively identical to anyone within that world. Therefore, if there's a possible world with a trickster God who's going to punish the good in the afterlife and reward the evil, but created a world that otherwise looks exactly identical, just to trick you, and a world that has a real good God, there would be no way for you as an individual in either of those possible worlds to tell the difference. Regardless, how much good you think there is in the world, you have no way of disproving the claim that God could be evil. Check out our video on the duplication argument for more on this general form of argument and how it's used in skepticism. Now, the only objection I can see to such an argument is to claim that such a trickster God is logically impossible, that there is no such possible world that appears exactly like this one, but is run by a trickster God. Now, some versions of the ontological argument do attempt to make this move, but as we've seen in our series, they fail for a range of reasons, largely around failing to be able to provide necessary and sufficient conditions for a, quote, great-making property. But check out our long series on the ontological argument for more there. What do you think? Is God secretly evil, or perhaps obviously evil upon a careful reading of Scripture or examination of the horrors of the world? If you knew that God existed but was evil, would you worship him? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Watch this video and more here at Carneades.org. Subscribe if you're interested. Hit that notification bell if you like this video and you want to see more, and stay skeptical.